Hello, welcome back to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. I hope you've got your coffee ready to go and joining us for another topic. Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks, Jake.
You don't have a coffee in hand, but I'll forgive you.
I
That's
do
okay.
not.
I've got a golden era plan for you guys today. We haven't covered one of these for a while, and these are always your favorite because this is very similar to how you would choose to train if you're shaking your head already. Okay, I'm just going to jump into it. This is a long one, so I'm going to do my best to condense it. So this is a 1972 plan. Okay, so we're talking what, 10, 15 years into this sort of golden era style of training now. This is Steve Michalik. So Steve won Miss America, Mr. USA. He won the Mr. Universe in these are all like sort of early 1970s, 95, I think he won Mr. Universe. And he was on track to do really well. He was on track to compete in the Olympia, and then he had a really significant car accident. And I don't recall if he came back after that or if that was the end of his career, but it was like took him a long time to rehabilitate. So fairly tragic ending for Steve, but amazing physique. And this was his Mr. America routine. And just by the by, I know I shouldn't really mention this, but I get a lot of flack online when I talk about why I focus on silver era lifters. And I say that, we know that these guys were natural. If drugs weren't available at this time, we'll kind of know that they weren't using them. And then people will say, oh, but there's natural lifters today. And there was natural lifters in the golden era and blah, blah, blah. And, it's disingenuous to assume that people are taking gear when they say that they're not. And, I don't want to sort of badmouth Steve, and he had amazing physique, but I think this is a really interesting example here because Steve went on record actually saying that he didn't use anything. And he even named silver era lifters. He goes, hey, look at people like Grimmick, look at people like Steve Reeves and Eiferman and Dredge Park. These guys didn't take any anabolics, and I don't either. And then you look at how he trains, and you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not how these guys trained. And then much later on in life, after he stopped competing, he comes out and he says, oh, actually, by the way, guys, I did use anabolics. And, this is the kind of thing where I look at it today, I'm like, well, there's people who will just tell you straight up that they're not using them. And you look at the training, you're like, well, it doesn't really gel. It doesn't make sense. So that's my little bias, little rant for today. I'll get off my soapbox. So
The way,
Steve's
the way
plan.
I would the way I would look at it is to say it's perfectly possible to divorce the emotional and the cognitive. You can literally just divorce those two things. So if somebody says to you, or if you follow somebody, an influencer online, and they say to you, "Oh, I'm completely natural," you can take them at face value, and you can say, "Okay, that's great, fantastic, good for you." Clap, 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 and then you can just basically cognitively say, the only kind of sort of anecdotal data that I'm going to accept as valid is going to come
Mm,
from the silver era, because
mm,
kind of cognitively, I think that it's unwise to rely on anecdotes once steroids have been entered
mm,
into circulation, because like you don't really know what
yeah,
is going on. So I would just say, look, divorce these two things. One is an
yeah,
emotional attachment that you have to a relationship or a person that you kind of respect, and they say to you, I'm not taking gear, and like, okay, fine, good for you,
yeah,
fantastic. And then equally, you can cognitively say, well, when it comes to training, I'm only really going to look at the anecdotal evidence from
yeah,
people pre 1950. And I think you can do those two things. I think absolutely just separate those two things out and say, just because I use only that group of people as my anecdotal data source doesn't mean that I don't, I'm not automatically assuming that other people are, using anabolics when they're claiming not to in today's day and age. I'm just simply saying that it makes life a lot easier, because there was a whole bunch of guys back then who you can 100%
yeah,
guarantee never did any of that stuff because there wasn't any stuff to do. You can just use that data and be really, really confident that it's valid. As soon as you start diluting that data with extra people from post 1950, you are now making that data set less valuable, not from just from a risk point of view. So
yeah,
just why bother? Because there's a whole
yeah.
gigantic data set you can use
Yeah, I mean,
instead.
that's it. Even if you had 10 people who claimed to be natty and you included their
What's
information, their
the
training plans into
positive
it,
value of including those people?
yeah, because if
Minimal,
one of them
marginal.
isn't, it just
Because if one
muddies
of
the
those
data.
isn't, you
Yeah.
absolutely start stuffing up your data set. I mean, I can think of some, pretty horrible metaphors that you could use to kind of start talking about it. I mean, basically, it would be like dropping kind of something really, really nasty tasting into your coffee. The coffee is fantastic on its own. Like, well, yeah, but if I put something like some spice in there that make it taste nicer, and very quickly you could run into a situation make it taste horrible because you kind of added too much, cinnamon or whatever it is that you were adding to it to try and make it taste better. I'm trying to kind of find a
It's a
metaphor
very
that isn't.
sanitized metaphor you're giving us.
It's a sanitized metaphor. You know exactly what metaphor I'm thinking of at the moment. Famous philosophy metaphor. But ultimately, I'm trying to provide an image for people that things like you over, kind of salt the soup, or you over cinnamon, the drink that you're trying to make taste better, and you've won nothing in that. You've made it taste horrible. And if you
Yeah.
just left it alone, you'd had a really nice cup of coffee that you could have enjoyed. So I think that's the problem when you start forcing extra kind of data into a data set that doesn't need the extra data, because it's a really solid data set on its own. You simply don't need those extra data points from, today, when you're running an enormous risk that the person that is, running a kind of influencer account on Instagram has gigantic incentives to use anabolics. Just insane
Yeah. Yeah.
incentives to use anabolics. The risks that they are taking them are too high really to discount.
So the plan today, Steve would do 2 days on, 1 day off, and then repeat. So it didn't fit nicely in a week, but his workout week, I guess, sort of ran a little bit different to a calendar week. And he kind of followed the same structure. So it was 2 days that he would alternate, and each exercise he would do 4 sets, and he would increase the load with each additional set. And for most of his exercises on that final set, except for his leg exercises, but for everything else on his final set, he would do the set to failure, and then he would reduce the weight by about 15 to 20%, go again, do a set to failure. So he would do 3 drop sets, okay? Reduce it again by 15 to 20%, go again to failure, and then do it a third time. So essentially his last set would be 4 sets, and he would do sort of 3 ramp up sets until that set. So a lot of sets, and he would do very short rest periods. He would do a minute or less between each set rest period. So day 1 was legs and back. So he would do a leg press, remembering this is all for 4 sets. So leg press, he would do leg curls, he would do hack squats, he would do leg extensions, he would do standard squats, and then he would do his back work. So then he would do a cable row, and this was actually for 6 sets. Then he would do his bent over row again for 4 sets, a lat pull down for 6 sets, and then a bent leg deadlift. So he gets, I don't know if that's like a off the floor, if that was more like a Romanian style, and that was done for 4 sets as well. So pretty mammoth leg day. His second day, again, this is all for four sets. Some of these exercises he would do for up to 6 sets, including his little drop sets at the end. He would do a barbell pullover. He would do a bench, decline bench, incline bench. He would then do seated shoulder press with a machine, seated behind the neck on a machine. He would do lateral raise with dumbbells, shrugs, and then he'd do his triceps work. These were all for 6 sets. He would do lying triceps curl on a bench, like flat. He would do seated triceps curl. He would do decline triceps curl. And then he'd do his biceps work. He would do preacher curl, 1 arm at a time, 4 sets, incline curl. And they used, I don't know if you guys have seen, it's called a half moon bench. And this was big in the silver era. It's kind of like a circular shaped bench that you would like arch your back over. They look very weird if you Google them. But he'd do a curl on this bench for 4 sets, a standing curl for 6 sets, and then a preacher curl, I think, for 4 sets again. So we're talking like, what, 6, 12, 18, 24, 34, 42, goodness me, 62. We're talking about 70 sets or something like that in that workout. Very short rest periods, less than a minute, supersetting some of these exercises. And if that's not enough, he also, every single workout, would do 15 sets of calves for about 20 repetitions. And he would do this either on like a standing calf press or leg press, so like toe press style. And he would also do abdominal work. Now he would do abdominal board. So I guess like a kind of like a leg raise type exercise. And he would do 50 to 75 repetitions for that. Then he would kind of do a mechanical drop set, and he would do another 50 to 75 repetitions, and then one more mechanical drop set and another 50 to 75 repetitions. And that was for each workout. He would do the ab work and the core work. It's a lot of work. What do you think of all that?
So I think this is probably appropriate for me to say that this is unsalvageable. You know,
Yeah,
this is
I think
actually
so. I think so.
unsalvageable. I mean, like, I can't analyze this and say, "Oh, well, if I change this and that, you know, it'd be all right." I can't. There's nothing salvageable about this.
I mean, the reality is he's thrown just about every exercise at it, right? So we could pull out some of those exercises and be like, yeah, great. If we keep those exercises, we could make a good plan. But you can do that
To be honest,
anytime someone throws
even
enough at it.
even then, I have problems because ultimately, like with the pressing, you know, you've got a bench press and then a decline press and an incline press. Well, I'm going to want to know what the grip widths are there because ultimately, if the
Yeah,
grip widths aren't that different, then the exercises aren't that different, really. A lot of people massively overestimate how much
yeah,
you're changing when you go from incline to decline to flat. You're not changing that much if your grip width doesn't change. If you change the grip width, then stuff really does start to change. But unless I see that, then I'm assuming that that's basically just 18 sets of nonsense.
we do have the pullover in there, so at least at least we've got something that's biasing different parts of the chest.
And then, like with the overhead pressing, again, like behind the neck to in front of the neck, that's not a big change. That's really not a big change. I mean, that's like
Yeah,
arguably
depending on the grip width, yes,
front
sure, unless he was
frontal
doing
plane
sagittal plane.
to frontal plane to maybe at best scapular plane is
Yeah,
not the same as frontal plane to sagittal plane, for example. So, um, and I think the same thing is arguable about the triceps extensions and the curls. You know, the differences aren't staggering between them. I could literally give you, you know, kind of two exercises that would be poles apart from each other and would
yeah.
give you far better coverage than the 4 or 5 kind of exercises that he's thrown into the mix. So genuinely, when I say it's unsalvageable, I'm not just saying it's unsalvageable from the point of view of it being an insane amount of volume. I actually don't like the exercise selection either.
Yeah, even if you drop this down to single sets,
It
it
doesn't
still
work.
is yeah.
It's still bad. It's
On the
biomechanically, it's still bad.
shoulders, so he's got his in front of the neck, in front of the head shoulder press on the machine. So let's say that was more kinda, I guess, leaning towards frontal plane as an example, and then the behind the neck on the machine, so again, that'll be full frontal plane. If you and then he's got the lateral raise with dumbbells. Now, technically, a lateral raise with a dumbbell, you would argue that that's probably doing from a shoulder perspective, that would probably do about the same as a behind the neck, would you say?
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, the only benefit you're getting is it's single joint. So if you can stabilize it, and that's always the big if. I mean, if you're using dumbbells, it doesn't really work. But if you're using like a machine, you're doing lateral raises, especially if you're using single arm, then yeah, you are going to have the ability to basically pair that with a behind the neck overhead press, and you've basically got the multi-joint exercise first, and then you do the single joint targeted exercise afterwards. And you kind of it's basically like a physiological drop set, really.
Yeah. But it's kind of fairly even. If you're using a dumbbell, like, you're getting decent anterior delt, you're getting good middle delt. Like, I would look at that and think, well, it's a little bit more middle delt focused, but you're kinda getting both, and that's the way I think about it behind the neck. It's like, well, you're probably getting a little bit more middle delt, but you're still getting anterior delt, yeah?
Yeah, it's just, you know, ultimately, it's not going to be quite as high a level of recruitment in the anterior as you would do from a sagittal plane variation. So, you
Yeah,
know, I mean, it's just like what particular thing do you want to target?
yeah.
But I actually, yeah, as I say, I'm not a fan of the exercise selection here. You know, I think like doing leg presses and hack squats and full squats. I'm like, honestly, seriously, again, that's 18 sets of nonsense. I mean, like, again, it doesn't really do anything. Right? Like, and you got one like leg curl variation in there when really, if you're doing all of this work, you expect there to be a seated and a lying variation in there. And then ultimately, he's got my two current least favorite exercises on the planet right now, which are the barbell bent over row, which everyone knows I'm just not a fan of because it doesn't
You
really
know,
do
not
anything very
everyone
well.
knows that because I spoke to
Okay,
someone yesterday in the gym, And
Okay.
I did the Smith machine bent over row, and I said, "Man, if only Chris could see me now." And they said, "Oh, I didn't know that he hated that exercise."
Oh, yeah, okay, let me go on record then. No, the barbell version of that exercise I don't like. Ultimately, I don't like it because if you okay, the biggest reason I don't like it is because most people turn it into a horizontal power clean. And then obviously it's there's so much body English going on that it's not
Mhm.
targeting what you want to target. It becomes a lower body exercise, and ultimately that's the primary reason. So it's just hugely unstable. So you're kind of addressing a big chunk of my like disgust for this exercise by doing it in Smith. The second issue is that it's really not the exercise people think it is. Because if you look at the EMG data that's been done on this exercise, it is very much a lower back exercise. That
Mm.
tends to be where a lot of the activation takes place. There are better ways of training the lower back than doing a bent over row. Um, and, so pair those two things together, and I'm like, I just don't like it. It becomes a more of a kind of power type exercise, which is not really a hypertrophy purpose. There's too
Yeah.
much instability, too much range of motion when people start moving the torso and doing a lot of hip extension. Um, and as I say, it doesn't really target what people think they're targeting. They're like, "Oh, I'm training my upper back." I'm like, "No, you're actually training your lower back." That's kind of what the exercise is doing. And then on my Instagram stories, kind of yesterday or the day before, I was just making the point that I think the RDL, or what is probably written
Mhm.
here as bent leg deadlift, is like the barbell bent over row of the lower body because it kind of suffers the same issue. It kind of doesn't really train anything kind of particularly very well, and what it does train isn't what you think it's training.
Mm.
Um, so it's
Yeah.
not training the hamstrings. It can't do that. So it's kind of a Dr. Magnus bit of glute there. Bit of knee extension, bit of lower back. I mean, like it's and the variation in the movement is going to be quite high. People are going to do a slightly different movement pattern every single rep. Whereas if you stiff leg it, then you're going to get a reasonably reliable movement pattern that trains the hamstrings and the adductor magnus pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking about the RDL and what you are getting out of it. I mean, because you would you be maintaining hamstring sarcomegenesis with it
Well, I don't think the hamstrings will switch on with it really. I think when
in
people
the
say, "Oh,
eccentric?
I'm doing an RDL," they're actually doing a stiff leg at the point when they're doing the exercise. If they're creating hamstrings adaptations, then it's a stiff leg. It's
But
not
if
an
you're in
RDL.
the eccentric portion of the RDL,
Well, if the knee's not
it
moving, then fine. But if the knee's moving, then no.
mm,
So yeah, I mean, if you're in a fixed position for the knee and you start, hinging at the hip and you start lowering, but again, I mean, like nobody is doing super maximal efforts with an RDL. So, or not
no.
many people anyway. So you're still talking about the bottom half of the kind of motor unit pool. So it's
Yeah.
a small
Yeah.
amount of
No, it's
small
not a
amount of
good e
sarcomere
I'm
is really.
I'm not trying to argue that it's a good exercise for the hamstrings, but
It's
I
it's
think
horrid. It
I just
really
know
is.
someone's gonna come at us and be like, "Oh, but you get this
Stiff leg is
tiny
way
amount
better.
of."
Stiff leg is
Yeah.
anybody okay, let me be clear. Anybody who wants to argue with me about RDLs, they need to argue that the RDL is better than the stiff leg deadlift. That's what I'm arguing,
Mhm. Mhm.
okay? I'm just gonna say every time somebody says, "Well, RDLs are good for this," I'm like, "Stiff legs are better."
Yeah, just make this
They're
one
they're
little
just
tweak.
always better.
It's
Stiff legs are always
infinitely
better.
better.
Yeah,
Yeah.
always better. There's no scenario in which an RDL is gonna be better than a stiff
Yes.
leg deadlift for anything. It's just not gonna happen. Um and if they're like, "Oh, well, but I get more glute from the RDL," then you can stop talking to me now because, if you're not doing hip thrust, if you're interested in glute training, you're not doing hip thrusts, then we can't have a conversation. So
If that's
it's
how you
not
feel about
a
the
great
the RDL,
exercise.
I don't wanna get you started on the bent over row again.
It was just something I was thinking of yesterday. I suddenly realized that that's how I feel about it. It's the bent over row of the lower body.
Okay, so exercise selection, not a fan.
This is
Volume,
the worst program you've ever shown us. I am convinced. It's horrid. It's really bad. It's bad on so many levels.
okay, is there anything good you can pull out of this? I've got one. It's a two-way split. For gold, I mean, obviously, Golden Era, they kind of started with that, right? Like they sort of used either they were still doing full body or they turned it into a two-way split. So I would say the split itself is better than what we see most people doing today.
So how is that working? Is he doing A, B, off, A, B, off?
Yes.
So it's slightly higher frequency than.
Yeah,
Um,
slightly higher because he does have that off. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
yeah, only very slightly.
yeah. Look, we've got to take the wins where we get them.
Okay, this is
Is there
bad.
any before I'm gonna let you move on, you need to find one thing that you like about this.
Well, again, I mean, like, you would have to make so much, you'd have to modify so much to get to the point where there was something that I liked. But if you did strip it all the way back to single sets, then arguably having that behind the neck overhead press followed by a lateral raise does kind of move in the direction of being a physiological drop set. So it kind of has an interesting exercise order kind of feature there. So that's kind of somewhat interesting, but I suspect in the context of everything else, that it's probably random.
It is it is interesting looking at the fact that he was doing so 4 sets and then his, like, 4 kinda drop set or 3 drop sets. And those ramp up sets, he was adding a lot of weight over those sets, right? And again, he was only taking a minute off. So he was starting with, like, half the weight that he was finishing on, but he was doing the same repetition. So he's doing, let's say, 10 reps or whatever. He's doing his first set with half the load this last set is being done on, even though he's having such short rest periods. So he's accumulating fatigue and he's still adding weight. So those earlier sets, like, what is he doing with those earlier sets? So the earlier sets would be so far away from failure. It's not even funny. Like, presumably he is literally using those earlier sets to accumulate fatigue. And it goes back to that conversation we had a long time ago where we're saying, is there some protective thing these guys are doing here who are in fact using a lot of gear and actually inducing some of this fatigue, maybe in some ways protecting them because they're not using as much load and whatever. I don't know, but it's just so much, yeah, so much volume that we would say is really it's unstimulating volume, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not really doing anything of anything. I really don't like it. Um, I mean, again, we've talked about this kind of warm up set issue before. I know that it's been talked about recently. Um, the strength training sets that are done prior to a main set, and when I say a main set, I'm very simply defining a main set as any set in which there are some stimulating repetitions. That would be by definition a main set. These sets that are done prior to a main set, which are generally called warm-up sets. Warm-up is an inappropriate terminology, really.
Mm.
I've talked with Rob about this on the last podcast that we did, or the podcast before, and we kind of wondered whether it'd be better to call them preparatory sets or preparatory
Mm.
reps. Um,
Mm.
because to say the phrase warm up is misleading because there is no warming effect. There is no temperature increase being created. I know that there's been a couple of people go on podcasts recently and say, oh, yeah. The strength training sets done before the first main set are warming the muscle up. No, they're not. There is literally zero data to suggest that. You cannot show me a study that says that doing a strength training set with lighter loads or reps in reserve or whatever prior to the main set is creating a temperature warming effect on the muscle. They're not. We've got data showing that cardio does that. We've got data showing that sitting in warm water does that. Probably Rob's idea of standing under a hot shower for however long he stands under a hot shower for probably is going to get you to a similar place.
I've
But
got clients
strength
who do
training
that
sets
too, and they
don't do
seem to think it
that.
works.
There isn't enough time for them to do that. And we've got no evidence to suggest that it does happen. So, really, really misleading to think of the kind of sets as having a temperature warming effect. They're not doing that. We're very simply just making sure that we're feeling safe and confident in the movement. And that's why it takes longer in a free weight situation. So like you jump on a leg press, you can get to your work weight relatively quickly. You start warming up for squats, it's going to take you a lot longer. You're not really warming anything. There's no warming taking place. It's a hugely misleading terminology. I've talked on this podcast 100 times about how when we forget what's happening physiologically, we start just hearing the words and we start
Mm.
misunderstanding what's going on. You've got to get underneath the words and go, what's actually happening? And we call them warm-up sets, or I've suggested people call them warm-up reps. The brain kind of short circuits, or it takes a shortcut and it goes, oh, I'm seeing the word warm, so I'm thinking that I must be warming the muscle up. And no, it's not. It's not doing that. There's nothing of that nature taking place. we're just kind of gaining the confidence and like security in that particular exercise that we're not going to rip an arm
Mm,
off when we start doing the actual main set. That's the only reason we do it, and it takes longer with a free weight back squat because it's a more complicated, difficult, potentially dangerous exercise if you do it wrong. And that's not me bagging on squats because I'm literally just thinking of my own personal experience of
mm,
squatting heavy
mm,
weights. And there were moments when I was genuinely quite concerned. You know, I'm just drawing on my own personal experience of squatting. But, ultimately it took me probably 20 minutes to get to the point where I was comfortable to my work rate. And yeah, okay, I probably tilt onto the more kind of, sort of concerned end of the personality spectrum. Rob can kind of get there in probably about 10 minutes or even less, I don't know. But ultimately, it's like it's going to take longer just because it is a more complicated
mm,
exercise. But there's no
mm,
warming taking place. There's no warming of the muscle taking place. That is absolutely a hallucination by whoever's
mm,
kind of peddling that idea.
mm. Yeah, so really these sets that were being done here with these 3 or 4 sets with with lighter loads, they're not achieving anything from a warming up perspective, they're not achieving anything from a stimulus perspective, we're not sure what they're there
Not
for.
sure what they're doing. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we can probably leave it there. I
Okay.
don't
I
think
think I've made
there's
my
more we
views very clear on the subject. Not holding back today.
So, moving
So
on, there's a few things we wanna cover in this episode, and I don't know how to summarize it in a topic. So what are we calling this? What are we talking about?
So, let's just kind of again be, completely clear about where this inspiration has come from for talking about this, because I think that's appropriate. So, recently, influencer started talking about how you might be able to kind of consider stimulating reps as decreasing from one set to the next as the dose response of hypertrophy, kind of shows that we experience less and less stimulus from set one to set two to set three and onwards. So basically, it's like combining my weekly net stimulus model with my stimulating reps model and saying, like, okay, so the weekly net stimulus model shows or uses a very clear dose response relationship, which I kind of suggest to people they can pick, maybe the Schoenfeld data set, or they could pick, the Pelland data set, or they could pick like some kind of medium point between the two, or, whatever. And that basically just shows that, set one, for example, with Schoenfeld, obviously we sort of reference everything back to the first set. So the set two gives you, I think, maybe 40% of the set one value. Set three gives you another 20% on top of that for a total of, kind of 160% value of your first set. And that's from a single workout. So you can see the dose response is, relatively nonlinear. You could look at the Pelland data set, and the second set will give you 80% of the first, and the third set will give you 70% of the first. So kind of total of 250%. So you're kind of seeing that there's a clear nonlinear relationship, because for a linear relationship to be in place, you would have to have 300% as your value for the third, for all three sets. So ultimately, nonlinear relationships, and essentially that is kind of a big element of the weekly net stimulus model, that nonlinear nature, because that is why we talk about, one of the reasons why we talk about needing higher frequencies, because if you kind of are doing load of sets in a single workout, then what you'll find is that you kind of have to take a longer rest before you do your second workout of the week or whatever, and then you only get a smaller number of those first sets. If you are doing like a smaller number of sets, then you can obviously fit that into a week and do 3 or 3.5 times frequency, and you're going to get a lot more first sets. You're obviously going to end up with a much better kind of total muscle growth across the week. And that's why one of the main reasons why frequency is so important. So that's the weekly net stimulus model. The stimulating reps model basically says, what makes a repetition stimulate muscle growth on a whole muscle level? Why do we get muscle growth at all? And it basically just says, well, you need high level of recruitment to access motor units and therefore muscle fibers that are responsive to the hypertrophy stimulus. And then you need to apply some mechanical tension to those muscle fibers. So you end up saying, okay, well, approximately, 5 repetitions in relatively well-trained people. It's probably less than that in untrained people. It's probably, more than that in terms of the number of repetitions. You probably get up to, 7 or 8 probably in untrained people, maybe even more in elderly sedentary people, maybe like 10 or so. And then with, very well-trained people, 4 or 5 years of dedicated kind of strength training experience, you might be pushing that, to a smaller number. You might be looking at 3 or 4 or whatever. I don't know. I mean, the data on that is pretty thin. So basically, we're
Maybe that's worth
combining
actually
these
just
two models.
clarifying. So,
Sure.
why would someone who's sedentary be able to achieve hypertrophy, say, 7 repetitions away from failure, and someone who's very well trained may only be able to achieve hypertrophy, say, 4 repetitions away from failure?
Okay, so what you've got to do is you've got to have an image in your mind of Henneman's size principle. And I've done like infographics on this to help people visualize what's going on. But basically, every single muscle fiber in the muscle is connected, or part of, rather, is a better way of putting it, part of a motor unit. And those motor units are either going to be really, really small, with small number of muscle fibers, very oxidative fibers, and they're going to be classified as at the bottom end of Henneman's size principle sequence. And then as you progress up the sequence, you're going to kind of collect motor units with more and more fibers per motor unit, and they're going to be less and less oxidative until eventually you get to the very top of the size principle sequence, and you've got really big muscle fibers, large numbers of big muscle fibers attached to very high threshold motor units. So essentially, there's this sequence. As you send signal to the muscle, you're going to recruit, as you increase the signal that you're sending to the muscle, you're going to recruit more and more motor units until you get near to the top. Now, ultimately, as we go to the gym, what we're doing is we are switching on motor units that we don't use anywhere else. Okay. But if you then compare, if you imagine you've got somebody who's completely sedentary, somebody who's physically active, and then somebody who's kind of training in the gym, what you're going to see is that there are distinctive numbers of fibers in those groupings that the 3 groups of people are using. So ultimately, the sedentary person will not really use very many of their high threshold motor units at any point to do anything, especially if they're not, remotely physically active. I often sort of mention the fact that I tend to sort of stay in apartments which don't have lifts in. So I'm walking up and down stairs, potentially 4 or 5 flights of stairs, with the shopping that I've been to buy at the local supermarket. And if you carry a couple of bags of shopping and maybe a bottle of water or whatever up 4 or 5 flights of stairs, you are going to notice that you are using motor units that you don't use just walking around the house. And I think that's the bit that's interesting. Okay, so basically what you've got is you've got a sedentary person who never does any of that, just takes the elevator everywhere, drives in the car, never does anything kind of remotely challenging at any point. They're going to find that literally your bottom 30% of the motor unit pool is the only muscle fibers you're ever really going to switch on. Everything else above that is just going to be completely and utterly kind of atrophied. You start kind of walking places, carrying shopping up and down stairs, being a little bit more physically active. What you find is that you actually start to tap into the very, very bottom end of the high threshold motor unit pool. Now, I think that most physically active people have kind of already maxed all those fibers out. Now, the important point about that is that as you go from oxidative at the bottom end of the motor unit pool up to glycolytic, the capacity of the fiber to grow increases dramatically. And that's partly because of something called the size principle of striated muscle, the oxidative size principle. This is not Henneman's size principle. It refers to the maximum size that a muscle fiber can attain. Ultimately, the more oxidative, the smaller the size is. So ultimately, if you look at the very bottom end of the high threshold motor unit pool, you've got a whole load of muscle fibers which have a small capacity to grow, and then they're going to stop growing indefinitely. They're never going to grow again because you can't make them grow, because ultimately they won't go past that plateau size determined by their oxidative capacity. So I think what happens is that if you kind of compare a sedentary person with a very physically active person, and you put them both in a strength training program, what you find is that if you were doing like 7, 8 reps in reserve, maybe 9, 10 reps in reserve, the sedentary person would actually still display some muscle growth in that scenario. The physically active person would not, because what they would have already maxed out that kind of stuff at the very bottom end of the high threshold motor unit pool. And that's
Mm,
really analogous to what we're saying now with like people with different levels of training experience. If you get somebody who's
yeah,
been really hammering away and, for sort of 3 or 4 years worth of dedicated strength training experience, and they've been making progress through that time, they're not just been messing around in the gym, then they should have high levels of recruitment. They should have actually really got to a point where it's just those very high threshold motor units that are remaining, that they've got the capacity to grow, because everything prior to that point is tapped out. So I think that's kind of what's going on. It's this size principle of striated muscle that basically means that the more oxidated the fiber, the smaller it will stop growing. The smaller size it will stop growing at, basically.
yeah, yeah, great. It's not that someone who's advanced needs higher effort or whatever, strongly signal, anything silly like that. All it is ultimately further away from failure. They've maxed out those muscle
Yeah.
fibers.
It's just which fibers you're actually able to grow and which fibers you can't grow anymore.
Yeah, great.
Cool. So what I was kind of sort of bookending this with then is to say, well, okay, what we're seeing, and this is the inspiration for today's podcast. I think inspiration is the right word because we're not debunking anything. Because I think, broadly speaking, it's a pretty reasonable observation. I've just got some minor reservations about the way that it's kind of approached. Um, we're combining an element of the weekly stimulus kind of model by saying, there's a dose response of hypertrophy, and then saying, okay, well, can we combine that with a stimulating reps model? And so basically what the suggestion is that you can go, okay, well, can I say that I'm getting 5 stimulating reps, because that's the kind of number that everybody knows now. And some people even think that that is the stimulating reps model, which is not, but okay, fine. So if I'm getting 5 stimulating reps from my first set, does that mean that I can now say, well, if I use one of these data sets, like let's do it live, if I'm using Schoenfeld data set and I've got 40%, then that means my second set is 2 stimulating reps, because 40% of 5 is 2. Okay, well then if I look for my third set and I'm getting 20% of my first set additional, 20% of 5 is then 1, I guess. So,
Yeah,
um, is it?
yeah.
My math is running away with me right now. Um,
Yeah, so 5 for the first set, 2 for the second, and then 1 for the third.
so, um, basically, yeah, I've got 5, 2, 1. So, okay, that's like a very stark, kind of idea, like to look at that and go, well, that's quite frightening. I mean, that really does, and I think it's useful on the one hand to do that, because you can be like, okay, that's telling me that these additional sets really aren't giving me very much. I mean, like that first set is absolutely, kind of way more important than anything else. And that's kind of a big justification for the single set idea, is that, adding another set or two is really not going to give you very much at all. And I think that's good. I mean, if you use the Pelland data set, then I think you're looking at 5 for the first set, 4 80%, and then 3.5 for the third set. And okay, fine. Then you're looking at something that's a lot kind of sort of keeping those numbers higher. As I've said before, the reason I don't like the Pelland data set, it's got nothing to do with the study itself, no criticism whatsoever of the authors, simply the observation that in the time period between when the Schoenfeld dataset was used or derived and when the Pelland dataset was derived, a lot of very, very high volume studies were done. And I think that a lot of the super high volume tiers in the studies included in those datasets have got a muscle swelling problem. As a result, the high volume tiers tend to pull the high end of the volume kind of data set upwards, and that tends to make the lower end of the volume tier kind of have a steeper curve. So ultimately, I think that if we had eliminated muscle swelling, like I keep saying to people, it's really easy to do. Just go and copy exactly what they did when they subtracted muscle swelling from in the form of water from the lean mass increases in the study that I keep talking about, which has momentarily escaped me.
The
Um,
Cody Horn study, I think?
yeah, Yeah, I think so. So ultimately, just kind of use the control they used and eliminate the increase in intracellular and extracellular water, and you'll end up with a very clear picture of what actual muscle growth is actually going on. But nobody wants to do that. And I think the reason they don't want to do that is because it would show that a lot of high volume kind of tears are just muscle swelling. But anyway, the Pelham data set, nothing wrong with the actual study. It's literally just the fact that a lot of the studies that were done between the Schoenfeld and Pelham meta-analyses when they came out is pulling that data set high at the top end, and it's just causing the results to get skewed, I think, and show a stronger increase with increasing volume than is actually realistically, something we could expect. So anyway, we've kind of just very quickly talked through those numbers. All I want to do before we move on and start picking this apart and talking about what it means in practice is to alert people to the fact that if you combine the weekly net stimulus model or the dose response of hypertrophy with the stimulating reps model, what you cannot say is that, okay, so I'm getting 5 stimulating reps in my first set, and then I'm following the Schoenfeld model, I'm going to get 2 stimulating reps in my second set and 1 stimulating rep in my third set. What you can't do is say that 2 stimulating reps in set 2 and that 1 stimulating rep in set 3 are happening in those specific repetitions of the set. So it's not the last 2 repetitions of set 2 and it's not the last repetition of set 3 that are stimulating, and everything prior to that is not necessarily. And this is the really important point, because it depends on why you've got a reduction in total stimulus for that second set. Let's walk through 2 totally separate scenarios. Are we good so far?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's walk through 2 separate scenarios. Let's imagine that I've taken I'm doing a multi-joint exercise like shoulder press, and I'm taking relatively short rest period, like was done in the Golden Era program that you were talking about, 1-2 minutes, something like that. And I go from my first set to my second set. Now, I'm going to expect, therefore, that I'm going to be carrying some supraspinal central nervous system fatigue from the cardiovascular sensations, maybe a bit of metabolite-related kind of burning in the muscle. Maybe I've done some kind of stupid leg workout beforehand, it wasn't a leg workout, was it? Something you're pressing, but maybe I'm doing a back exercise or lat pull down. I've done a stupid leg workout before I start doing my lat pull downs in the case of the Golden Era program we were talking about. In that scenario, I'm expecting to have a lot of kind of exercise order effect, which is mostly mediated by the inflammatory kind of myokines that build up over the course of an exercise bout. I'm going to have a supraspinal fatigue effect from that. So I'm getting a big supraspinal CNS fatigue effect. Recruitment is going to drop, and that is going to absolutely chew off reps off the end of my set. So I'm going to lose repetitions at the end of my set, and I'm going to find that, yes, in that scenario, my 2 stimulating reps, in the case of following the Schoenfeld data set, are probably the last 2 reps of the set. So if I did 2 reps in reserve on my second set for whatever reason, assuming I've gone to failure on my first set, and I get 2 stimulate, and I leave 2 reps in reserve on my second set, I've probably not got any stimulating reps at all. But if I don't have that supraspinal CNS fatigue, and the only main contributor to a decreased stimulus of my second set is stimulus saturation, then I actually do get a small contribution of stimulus from every single one of those 5 stimulating reps, because technically the reps are all stimulating. And this is why it's really important to differentiate between why is something happening and what is happening. I think a lot of people kind of just run to what is happening. I'm like, well, just tell me why it's happening. Why it's happening, then you can start to make some useful comments and predictions about what's going on. If we know why something is happening, we know why it's reducing the stimulus is, because of the fatigue mechanism at present, then you will find that it's actually now the last 2 reps that are counting for most of the stimulus, because if you don't get those, then they're the only ones, your recruitment has dropped so much that if you don't kind of meaningfully push recruitment and effort high to the point where you're getting into that stimulating zone, then nothing's going to happen. But if you haven't got that problem, you haven't got that supraspinal CNS, and that actually the main reason that you're experiencing the reduction in adaptation is because you've hit stimulus saturation, then actually it's all 5 stimulating reps at the end of the set that are going to contribute to that situation. Is that clear?
Yeah, fairly. So ultimately what we're saying is that second set could look vastly different, okay? It could be that all those last 5 repetitions from failure as stimulating, or it could be that only a couple of those last repetitions are stimulating because you're not getting sufficiently close to failure because you're coming into that set fatigued, right?
Yeah.
Now,
From the supraspinal CNFT effect. I mean, that's the really
yeah,
critical thing. I mean, ultimately, you should be able to notice that because you should be dropping reps like crazy if you do that,
yeah.
assuming you're keeping
Now,
the same weight.
you could also be coming into that first set fatigued as well from, you're doing your first back exercise and you're coming in fatigued from your leg work.
Well, then
And so
this doesn't work because you haven't got 5 stimulating reps in your first set anyway.
exactly, exactly. Yeah. That first set, you've got your 2 repetitions or whatever. Now, if we look at the Schoenfeld data, presumably, I don't know if you know the answer to this off the top of your head, but presumably that data is derived, I would imagine, from some studies and some training protocols where those participants probably do have some fatigue when
Yeah,
they're going into that second
sure,
set.
sure.
So we're probably getting a bit of a blend. We're probably seeing the effect of that diminishing or that saturation effect, and we're probably seeing some of the effect of fatigue in those later sets as well in this data, yeah?
Yeah, that is always the problem with these data sets.
So it's plausible that if someone were programming in a specifically intelligent manner, that second set could be more stimulating than people think of it as being.
Yeah, so what would happen then, though, is that you would pull forward your stimulus saturation from the third set.
Yeah. Talk through that. That's interesting, and there's implications here for how people program.
So basically, if you start stripping away the fatigue mechanisms effect and you end up with only stimulus saturation as a reason why you are plateauing in terms of the stimulus set, then ultimately you will not have a limitation on the stimulus that you can get from the second set from a fatigue mechanism. And so the only thing then really that is creating an issue will be the stimulus saturation. And you're capable of creating a bigger stimulus in that second set because you haven't got any fatigue mechanisms present. So you end up just kind of chewing through that stimulus saturation earlier. And then your third set is now going to be less valuable than it was if you hadn't done that. So I think
So at a
it
certain point, that
starts
stimulus is
to
100%
steepen the curve.
saturated.
It starts to steepen that curve and you get where you're going faster. So, and this is where the inspiration for today's conversation was coming from, because the original, post that talked about this was making, I think, more or less the same point, which I agree with, which is that if you train with longer rest periods and you avoid, supraspinal sinus fatigue sources, then ultimately you should be able to get to a point where you get a lot more out of a smaller number of sets. So, it really starts to say 4 or 5 sets. Why would you even ever go there? It makes absolutely no sense.
So ironically, you could probably say that if you did this, if you trained with long enough rest periods, maybe you were being, because, you've talked about supraspinal CNS fatigue, but also if you're doing lengthened position work or whatever, there's going to
Sure,
be
you're gonna find that
calcium.
you have an issue with that if you start, but, with eccentric training, super maximal eccentric training in athletes, you tend to plateau after 3 sets because of that calcium-related
Okay.
fatigue. So,
Okay.
honestly, I think probably you're still gonna be talking 4, 5, 6
Still have
sets
it.
at the point where it becomes an issue.
Okay. So if you're very mindful here about how you can mitigate the fatigue, then you could actually probably get that second set looking closer to the Pelin data
To
set.
You could probably get it moving in that direction. I mean, ultimately, the maximum it's gonna go and still fit with the Schoenfeld is gonna be 60%. So you're not gonna get to the 80% that Pelland have got. Um, but I think, yeah, you could get it to 50 or maybe even 60. I mean, I think that's kind of, and that would broadly mean that, your third set is gonna be pretty meaningless, I think, in that
Mm,
scenario.
yeah, the more effective that second set is, the less effective that
Yeah,
third set
sure.
is.
And then the same thing then applies to the fourth and the fifth. That's what I'm saying. I think really what this conversation does is draw attention to the fact that because a lot of the data, as you say, has been taken from scenarios where fatigue definitely is within workout fatigue is definitely present. Um, potentially a lot of supraspinal fatigue from being tired from previous exercises, and rest periods generally in these data sets are not long. They're pretty much always sort of 3 minutes or so, sometimes even two. So I think there's definitely an argument to say that if we had a data set where everybody was leaving
Mm,
5 minutes between every single exercise, it would probably be a steeper dose response curve that showed that you get more benefit from set two than you get from, set two at the moment. And similarly, you get more benefit from set three you will get from sets four and five. And instead of showing a plateau sort of 6 to 8 sets, it would probably show a plateau at 4 to 5 sets, something like that, which interestingly is pretty much bang on with what you get with animal models. But,
so if your goal was to get to that point of 100% stimulus saturation, then you think if you gave it 5 minutes between sets, you're some maybe
well,
even
you
longer,
won't get
you
to 100% because, sorry, I misunderstood what you said. And then I caught up with you momentarily afterwards. So what you're saying is if your goal is to make sure that the only thing reducing the benefit of your second
yeah,
set is stimulus saturation,
yeah.
then yeah, you would want to, kind of place the exercise sequence earlier in your workout. You'd want to, kind of make sure that you left a long rest period. You'd want to choose your exercises relatively carefully. All stuff that we've talked about before.
Yeah, and so what do you think the ceiling is there for volume? You think about 4 or 5 sets?
Well, I think what you're doing is you're pulling down from kind of probably where it is at the moment, 6 to 8. You're pulling it down to more like probably 4 or 5. And again, those when we're talking about plateaus existing at 6 to 8, we're saying basically you're adding a few percent per set at that point. You'd be
Yeah.
adding a few percent per set on your 4 and 5. I think probably the total value of stimulus you can probably get is around about 200%. So 2 full sets, if they were capable of doing that, I think is probably where you get to. I think you'd probably hit that at like 3 to 4, maybe, like, depending on how you're running the numbers, it might take you 5. But I think honestly, that 4 and 5 would be so pointless. I think you'd get to, probably sort of 180 by the time you'd done 3 sets if you did them properly.
So say you weren't training anything else, you were doing one muscle
Mhm,
only, and you were
mhm.
doing a set of 5 to failure or, 0 reps in reserve, and you were doing 1 set, on the hour, every hour kind of thing. You reckon by the time you've hit the 3rd or
Yeah,
4th hour,
I
that's
think,
probably it for the day?
I think that's probably it. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the interesting thing here is that, this working through this is interesting because it kind of pushes me in two directions simultaneously.
Mm,
Um, Now, on the one hand, it weakens one of the practical comments, the practical recommendations that I've made for. I actually don't mind when things weaken my practical recommendations. People think I'm going to freak out, but I'm just kind of interested in how the physiology works. But it weakens very slightly my practical recommendation that people just do single sets of everything.
mm,
It weakens that because it kind of says, well, hang on a minute. If I do have the time to kind of structure my workout in a
mhm.
way that gives me the space to fully recover, that second set is actually starting to look quite attractive.
Yeah.
But, generally speaking, most people aren't going to have that kind of time. But equally, it very, very much strengthens my suggestions on training frequency because if we're able to kind of basically get to a point where we're pretty much maxing out volume, usable volume within sort of 2 or 3 sets, then there is zero reason for anybody to do anything ever other than full body 3 times a week or 3.5 times a week. It's just the all the other splits just evaporate instantaneously at this point. They do. They just go away. I mean, like anybody at this point going, "Oh well, no, 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 I'm going to train twice a week." I'm like,
Explain that, because I
you're
know what you're
mad.
saying there, but I don't know if everyone followed that.
Well, what I'm saying, look, frequent. This is actually. I'm glad that you stopped me there because this is an incredibly important point to emphasize. I get dozens of questions where people ask me about the best frequency for something. I get dozens of questions where people ask me about the best volume for something. And I'm like, guys, you cannot ask these two questions in isolation of the other thing. Every frequency conversation is also a workout volume conversation. Every workout volume conversation is also a frequency conversation. They are literally integral to each other. You cannot separate them. For example, I had a question asking me, should older people drop down from 3 times a week to 2 times a week? I'm like, I can't answer that question because you haven't told me what workout volume you're intending on doing. So like I think that if you kept it at single sets and train with sensible kind of exercises, you probably could keep on training 3 times a week. Yes, we've got some really nice data showing that older animals to recover from the same workout volumes need to drop training frequency, but you could equally just drop training volume and do the same frequency and you get to the same place. I think people really just don't have that customary like instinct that I do of connecting these two things all the time. And I think it'd be really useful if we could try and encourage that a bit more, because every volume question is also a frequency conversation.
Well, I often get the question of what's the maximum amount of sets you can do in a workout for a muscle? Yeah, like what maximizes the stimulus for that muscle?
Well, this is what the
And
conversation we're having, isn't it? I mean, like in the
exactly.
literature, it's probably around 6 to 8, but there's so much fatigue in that if you strip it all out in the way that we're talking about today, you could potentially get to a point where it's like sort of 3 to 5,
Well,
maybe the
this is why that's
4
so
to 5.
interesting because normally I'd answer that by saying, well, that's the wrong question because the
It
answer
is the
might be
wrong
6 to 8 sets.
question.
But you do if your question was, I have 2 days to stimulate as much muscle growth as possible, what can I do? Okay, do 6 to 8 sets today. But if your question is, I've got weeks, I've got months, I've got years, well, doing 6 to 8 sets in a workout's not the answer
Very
because you're
simple.
going to
Yeah,
do that at the expense of frequency.
you
But
are.
what you've just outlined there is, well, hang on, what if you could get 6 to 8 sets worth of stimulus
Yeah.
in 3 sets,
4 to 5
which is
sets. Well, 4
recoverable
to 5
again?
sets. The 6 to 8 and the 4 to 5 are probably the two things that are comparable. It's just that
Okay.
when I say the 3, what I'm saying is it's like the 5 in the case of the 6 to 8. Doing 5 sets in the current model is almost as good as doing 6 to 8. It's just that the genuine plateau arrives at 6 to 8.
Yeah, okay. So what you've
Here,
gotten like
the
97% or
3
something like
is
that.
kind of like yeah, exactly. The 3 is equivalent to the 5, and the 5 sets are kind of just like, yeah, you're on the plateau there, but it's still kind of just grinding
Something
upwards
you
to
can
the last
technically see.
3%. But honestly,
Yeah.
just don't bother at it. So we're comparing like 5 sets of people, training, and 5 sets people would do like in a upper lower split training twice a week.
Yes.
And
Yep.
you can't really do that in any other scenario. You can't do that training 3 times a week. But 3 sets you can kind of, and so now if we're saying, and this is the question you asked me, now if we're saying that 3 sets is the kind of the reasonable top end for maximizing workout volume stimulus, if we're doing it in this way where we're making sure that stimulus saturation is the only thing that matters, no kind of fatigue related issues, then now you are completely evaporating any reason to even talk about upper lower splits because you can do 3 sets 3 times a week.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not
So
you're not
it
needing
literally
the
ends the
recovery
split
demand of 5
conversation
sets.
if you're prepared to go down this route of structuring a workout in a way that eliminates all major, well, all supraspinal fatigue really, and potentially avoids creating issues with calcium related fatigue, then yeah, you can pretty much just stop having a conversation about workout splits because there is no need to have one anymore.
So someone went back and listened to our episode on rest periods and then went all the way back to that episode we did on splitting up a full body into 2 sessions in the same day.
Mhm.
You could use those kind of underlying principles there to structure a workout routine we're talking about now, which could really maximize hypertrophy, maximize stimulus in three
Yeah, but
sessions per week.
what you're really doing there is you're kind of assuming that people have the time to do that. I think it is
Yeah,
going to.
absolutely. If someone wanted a maximalist plan,
I mean, it reminds me of Doug Hepburn kind of doing a set of squats and then hitting a golf ball and then walking to the golf
exactly.
ball and coming back again and then doing another set of squats. That's if you literally your job is to just lift weights, then you can probably do this. But most people are just not going to do this.
No,
It's just not
no.
feasible.
But there's plenty of people online who are doing anything it takes to come up with the most effective program possible. And for those people, this is probably worth thinking about.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of techniques that people can do. I mean, if they start moving towards a lot of really isolated single arm, single joint stuff, single leg, single joint stuff, then you can dramatically reduce the rest period that's necessary to get into this territory.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's where the kind of people who are doing like 60 sets per workout, that's where they're managing to make this work because they're just isolating everything, and there's no
Yeah.
cardiovascular response going on.
Yeah, yeah, you need to be selective with which exercises you're using that do have a significant cardiovascular demand. And even, we talked about in one episode, I think, where we're talking about, like, for PTs who are working in a gym, how to structure their sessions. And we talked about the idea of doing like almost like a circuit where you're doing one set of everything and then that client does another set. That would be another viable option here, where if you're using exercises that simply aren't requiring warm up
Mhm,
sets
mhm.
and or preparatory sets or whatever you want to call them,
Sure.
you could do your 10 exercises, 12 exercises, whatever, do a set of each, go, like we've talked about in the past, go have a glass of juice, sit down for 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, come back, feel refreshed, do another round of that circuit, still waiting adequately between each of those exercises.
It kind of starts to sound like the influencer workout, doesn't it? Because they're kind of like they've got a home gym and they're kind of like, sitting there working on the computer and they kind of do a set and
A little bit,
then
a little
go
bit. And that is very much what I do, to be fair, when I'm training at home. I do that myself. But at the same time, you could probably do what we've just outlined there in, 90 minutes, 2 hours. I know for some people that's a long time, but we're talking 3 times a week. It's not that much longer than what people are doing when they're doing their 4 or 5 sessions a week. Yeah, you do
well,
4 or 5
that's
sessions for
that's
50
an
minutes
interesting point, isn't it? That's an interesting point,
and you
especially
travel
if you
to the
start
gym,
to
travel home.
travel time. I mean, that's really where people are gonna get, notice the difference, I think.
Yeah. And I get some people may only have that 50 minutes every night. Okay, sure,
Sure.
that's a different
Yeah.
question. But other
Yeah.
people like, you know what, I can find 2 hours 3 times a week. One of those sessions will be on a weekend. I only need to find 2 weekdays. For some
Yeah.
people, this is perfectly viable and it's going to be
Mhm.
more effective.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, where were we?
So
What else?
so basically what we've done then is we've kind of worked through all the ramifications of pushing this in a direction of maximizing the stimulus of the second and also potentially third sets. So you
Mm,
kind of minimizing the contribution of supraspinal fatigue and potentially also calcium amyloid fatigue if you're kind of able to do that, and making sure that the only real negative is the saturation of the stimulus. If you now flip it the other way around and go, well, okay, what happens if somebody were to, pick a training technique that were to go in the opposite direction? So like a back off set. So if I were to do my normal strength training set and then I were to immediately do a back off set straight after that without, taking a lot of rest, or if I were to do drop sets, which we'd already talked about, then I'm basically going in the opposite direction. I am
mm.
reducing the benefit of that last set in comparison with what I would get if I were to just take a normal rest period. So essentially what we're doing now is we're saying, the last kind of 20, 30 minutes of discussion has been about pushing this in a direction where I've taken a longer rest and avoided any fatigue. And now doing the opposite, I'm choosing to make sure that there are still fatigue mechanisms present when I do that second set. What's going to happen? Well, it's going to do the exact opposite. It's going to reduce the value I get from that second set, and it's going to mean that I need more sets to get to the ultimate saturation point, which is why when we do drop sets, we don't really see any value of the drops. Everything comes from the first set. Everything after that is just noise.
So a moment ago, we've outlined how the first set, 100% stimulus of a first set sort of value. And we're saying, well, that second set, while the Schoenfeld data is saying maybe you get 40% of that first set, we're saying if we do all these things correctly, maybe we can get up to say, what, 70% or something.
No, no, no. That would be
And
Pellender data. I think you can't get higher than 60. I don't think
60, okay.
realistically.
Pellen's, I
Yeah.
think, is 80% for that second set, isn't it?
Sorry, 80% and then 70
Yeah.
for the third set. Yeah.
And so you're saying, okay, maybe we can push that 40 up to 60% if we do
Yeah,
all these
something
things
like that.
correctly. And now what you're saying is Well, even though the Schoenfeld data says 40% for that second set, a lot of people are training in ways where their second set might be giving them 20% because they're doing these silly
Yeah,
things
the
like
opposite.
taking a shorter rest period
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
And because back off sets, I think, is such a good example here, that back off sets don't necessitate that you don't take a rest period, but normally people aren't going to take a long rest period. They'll take a bit of weight off, they might rest for a minute, and then they pump out a set of 15 or whatever. And not
Sure.
only are you then reducing that second set, but now you're actually eating into the first set of your next exercise.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's not a good strategy. It's kind of one of those things that feels good when you're doing it, and it's just really deceptive. It's
You're doing it
really
to get a pump.
deceptive.
You're not doing it because it's
Yeah,
effective.
pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, arguably, if that's the way a back off set is being done, I would argue you're actually like, not only is it not achieving anything, like it may be a bit of a negative because
I would
it is eating into that next.
Yeah, I mean, like, I would imagine that a lot of people who are doing that are probably doing upper lower splits and they're not doing, kind of full body work. But,
Mm,
you know, I would encourage somebody who likes to do drop set, sorry, not drop sets, likes to do back off sets. I would encourage them to consider whether they could instead find a different exercise and do a work set with it, because at least then they would be getting some different muscle fibers being kind of loaded. So, okay,
yeah.
it's not a perfect solution, but it kind of at least is moving in a positive direction.
I mean, if you were set on doing some kind of back off set, literally you'd be better off not dropping the load, still resting the same amount of time. Say you normally rest a minute, still resting a
Again,
minute.
yeah, this is like kind of like you tried to find some value in this, and I'm like, honestly, okay, it's not quite as bad as the golden era program you've thrown at us today, but there's very little of value here to be salvaged.
Well, my point, I guess, is I just can't think of anything
The
particularly
physiological
worse.
drop set, there you go. Physiological drop set would give you the best kind of approach to this. If somebody really wants to do a back off set, I would say, don't do that. Think about a physiological drop set instead. Think about doing single arm work after your bilateral work or something like that.
If the exercise allows, yeah,
If the
absolutely.
exercise allows it, yeah, that would be
But
the
almost any other
salvaging.
method is going to be better than a back off set. Because even if you just did a rest pause with the same load, you're still not getting that same cardiovascular
Sure,
sort of fatigue
sure,
that you'd be getting.
sure.
So
Yeah.
I just don't understand why back off sets, like, it is purely because you're getting a pump. Why else would you do it?
Unfortunately, yes.
I don't, yeah, okay. I cannot think of a single benefit to a back off set,
But
except for
ultimately, you
you're
you could
unloading
you
the
could
weight anyway. I get
you
that,
could
but
you could kind of, kind of seek a fairly universal principle here that trying to get human beings to do things that's helpful for them rather than things that feel good is an uphill task. I mean, that's a pretty universal principle, isn't it?
very insightful of you. Yeah, so if only getting a pump didn't feel good, we would see better training plans
It's not
being
just
done.
the feeling, I think it's probably the fact that it makes the muscle look bigger
Look
momentarily,
bigger.
and that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that that I think is what people really like to see.
They're chasing. Yeah. Okay, so we can take a single set and we can make it more effective, more stimulating. That does not mean that we're only getting 3 or 4 repetitions of like the final 3 or 4
Sure.
repetitions. It
Yeah,
means that stimulus is spread over
you
those
can't
5.
conflate the weekly net stimulus model with the stimulating reps model automatically and just say, okay, because there's this percentage of stimulus in the second and third sets, which in Schoenfeld is 40 and 20, you can't just say, okay, that means because it's 40%, it's automatically the last kind of 2 reps of the second set and the last rep of the third set, and therefore those are the only reps in those 2 sets that matter. If you're doing it with fatiguing situations, then it probably is true because you are ending up dropping a lot of reps, and if you don't get those reps, you won't get into stimulating rep zone. But if you are taking long rests and you're making sure that you're not accruing a lot of fatigue, then the chances are that it's just stimulus saturation that's causing the issue, and then you can actually get all of your stimulating reps. It's just that each stimulating rep now counts for less. That's that's adding these 2 models together correctly.
This is making my head hurt because then you listen to that and you're like, oh, doing a second set kind of makes sense. But then when I think about that, I'm like, well, hang on. In the conditions that a second set makes
It's still
sense,
nonlinear. It's still nonlinear. It's still
it's
less
still not,
value
yeah,
than
But doing a first set of another exercise makes even more sense now. Because the argument people make against doing another exercise is, well, you're going into that exercise fatigued. Okay, but what if we take away that fatigue? So
Mhm.
that's the only time that second set makes sense. But now another exercise makes more sense as well.
Sure.
So we're still ending up with doing single sets.
Well, yeah, I mean, but as I say, I think the fact that the max kind of when I say maximum volume, the kind of practical maximum volume. So, like when I say 6 to 8 sets is the kind of plateau, it really means that 5 sets is the practical kind of limit that I think is sensible. Getting into that
Because those last couple of sets are just giving
because
you
those
such
last
small
is
amounts
you're
of single
just
set.
adding such tiny percentages that you like. And bear in mind, every single extra set you do counts for the same amount of post-workout fatigue. So
Yes.
post-workout fatigue increases linearly with increasing number of sets for that muscle group.
Yeah.
Whereas,
So we want to get as much stimulus in as few sets as possible.
exactly. So we're kind of looking at sort of avoiding doing unnecessary sets. So when I say 6 to 8 is kind of the plateau region, 5 is the practical kind of limit. So if we move that down to 4 to 5 is the practical is the actual kind of limit, and what we're really saying is that 3 is kind of the practical kind of end point. And if 3 is the end point, then it just ends the split conversation. It really does. And if you're ending the split conversation and saying that you're going to train three and a half times a week, then at that point, you then wanting to make sure that you get, you know, through every single thing that you want to do in a workout. Now, you could move that in the direction of A, B instead of just doing A all the time. And then you'll be able to reduce the number of exercises that you're doing. And then maybe in that scenario, you could do a second set. So you could
Mm,
go, if you're doing A, B, and you weren't doing a crazy number of exercises. So let's say
yeah.
you're kind of aiming for, I don't know, sort of 16 to 20 total exercises, and you split that across A, B, and you're now doing 8 to 10 in each workout, you could probably do 2 sets in that scenario. Maybe some people could
Yeah.
even do 3 for some of those exercises.
Yeah.
And that's starting to look like a pretty kind of, like you talked about consolidated plans a while back. I mean, that's starting to look like a consolidated plan in the sense that you're maxing out the stimulus from every single kind of workout that you're doing, really.
Mm, mm. Yeah. As long as it's done sort of A, B alternating.
As long as it's done A, B. You wouldn't be able to do that with A across the week. I mean, that just wouldn't.
Mm. Yeah.
But as you
Interesting. It's
point out, towards the back end of the workout, you still are going to be starting to lose some of the benefits. So I think it would lend itself better to scenarios where you had a clear focus. So like physique competitors wanted to focus on, kind of glutes and kind of whatever
yeah.
else that they focus on. I'm not an expert in that matter. You could construct a workout around that worked really, really well because the kind of upper body stuff that you would do at the end didn't just matter. And like some other people who have different goals might say, well, actually, I'm just interested in, kind of shoulders, maybe arms, traps, whatever. Well, okay, well, then you can construct a workout that does the same kind of thing and legs kind of just get done at the end. And it's okay, no problem. Again, we're not talking about, bodybuilding competition in that scenario.
Mm, mm. Yeah. So you can kind of merge, because in that situation as well, you can merge the 2 sets, single sets. Like you could use 2 really effective sets for a high priority muscle, and then you can still do single sets for everything else.
I think it's in scenarios where you've got a clear gradient of priority,
Mm.
where you've got stuff that you genuinely aren't that bothered about.
Yeah. Yeah. Which a lot of people, I'd say on average, most
As long as they're not
people,
competitors or, as I say, I
yeah,
mean, to be honest, even physique competitors probably fall into this category.
they
But,
still have something then to bring up. Yeah.
but, a lot of people are just going to have muscles they don't care about. And I think in that scenario, you probably could construct a plan which was probably 2 or 3 sets per exercise at the beginning of a workout.
Okay. Well, who expected us to be advocating for second sets in this episode?
We're not
I think.
advocating for it. We're just talking about how it kind of pans out. I mean, this is what I keep saying to people. I'm not. I think a lot of people just read other influencers who refuse to move from their kind of practical recommendations and start working backwards to make up physiological arguments for why their, their practical recommendations must be true. And I'm just like, that's not what I'm doing here. I'm literally just kind of trying to figure out how this works physiologically, and then, we'll go from there in terms of what practically drops out the bottom.
So ultimately, we're saying, hey, that second set, third set, it can be more stimulating, it can be less stimulating depending on what else you're doing. Go back, listen to our rest periods podcast if you want to learn how to make it more stimulating. Go back and listen to the drop set podcast if you want to learn how to make it less stimulating.
But yeah, just
And
be aware that when you start converting dose responses into stimulating rep numbers. So if you want to say dose response is non-linear, therefore first set has 5 stimulating reps, second set has 2, 3, 1, 2.5, whatever stimulating reps, third set has whatever, 1, half a stimulating rep. That does not necessarily mean that that stimulating rep is happening at the very end of the set. If you're one stimulating rep in a set, does not mean it's the final repetition of that set. It could be a blend of those repetitions. It really depends how you're getting there. And as you say, it's going to vary depending on how much fatigue you're actually creating.
yeah, so if you're going into that second set with as little fatigue present as possible, it does not mean that if you keep 1 or 2 reps in reserve, that you've
Lost everything. No, you
eliminated
haven't.
all that
No,
stimulus.
because
Yeah, yeah.
it's a stimulus saturation issue at that point. Every rep is technically stimulating. It's just that the entire kind of magnitude of stimulus that you're getting across the whole set is decreased. In contrast, if you get a ton of supraspinal fatigue because you're tired, you're feeling rough, then yeah, it probably is just the last rep that is going to matter. So it just
And we
varies how you
know
do it.
that there is a stimulus saturation. We know that that is a thing.
Yeah, because if you use electrical stimulation in rodents, you basically create stimulus saturation at about 5 or 6 sets, and they're
Yep.
using electrical stimulation. You can't really have any supraspinal sensitivity there at all. It bypasses the entire kind of process, and it also forces a level of contraction at the muscular level, which gets around some of the calcium amyloid mechanisms as well. So ultimately, we're pretty confident that when you see a plateau happening in hypertrophy in rodent models where they're using electrical stimulation, we're reasonably confident that's the stimulus saturation problem. Or
Yep.
you could argue it might be an oxidative stress issue if you wanted to, but that's going back to what we talked about recently.
Which either way, that would like the outcome of that would be
The outcome of
similar.
that would be the same. I mean, basically, what you'd be saying is that you're creating an unfolded protein response that's stopping MPS from being elevated in response to the end of the mTOR signaling process. Ultimately, that's the same thing as a stimulus saturation issue
Yeah, there's
in
still a
practical terms.
ceiling.
It's still a
Yeah.
ceiling. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Anything else you wanted to finish with, or is that
No, I'm good.
sort of okay? Well, there you have it. Second sets. No, not necessarily, but I think I do think it is a valuable way to think about if you are going to use those second sets, because I have seen a lot of people have really embraced single set training,
Yeah,
and
no,
obviously we
it
love that.
makes enormous sense. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, I'd say probably at least 50% of my programs, I am using multiple sets. Not for every exercise, but for some exercises in that program, there'll be a second set.
Mhm.
Um, and here's a way that hey, you can use both. You can use single sets, you can use 2 sets, you can even use a third set if you want. But if you are going to use it, how do you make it work for you and be more effective, more stimulating than kind of working against you and not really adding much, or in the case of back off sets, potentially even subtracting from the next exercise.
Totally.
Okay. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll be back again next week with a new topic.